This is The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners Chapter 2 Retribution. A standalone sequel to the first game, Retribution puts us back in the role of the tourist following the closing events of the first title. Remember the tower that kept coming up in the first game? Yeah, it's time to actually deal with that now, so stick around as we break down everything new and old in this follow-up to one of the best VR games ever made. Hey guys, it's Chris from the VR Grid, and welcome to our comprehensive review of the Quest 2 version of The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners Chapter 2 Retribution. Now, just a quick note on the release versions for those not in the know. Only the Quest 2 version launches December 2nd, and there is no Quest 1 version being planned. The PC VR version, which I have played an early version of, releases sometime in February 2023, with the PSVR 2 version planned for March 21st, 2023. Yes, there is a PSVR 1 version planned, with both a physical and digital version being released, but the only release date that we're getting from the developer is sometime in 2023. Anyway, with that info out of the way, please hit that like button, guys, if you'd be so generous, as it really helps out the channel. And yes, consider subscribing to the VR Grid if you like what we do and you want to see more. All right, now kicking off our review, I want to get into some story, but before I do, let me just preface this with the fact that Retribution, while a standalone game, really does expect that you have completed the first game. While the game does recap a few of the major events from the last game, this is very much a continuation of the story, and the sequel's narrative and gameplay jumps right off of that, so spoiler alert. Anyway, upon the fate of the coveted reserve from the first, you now find yourself hunted by a new, seemingly unstoppable threat, a looming armored juggernaut out for your blood. Meanwhile, the tower, New Orleans' authoritarian powerhouse, has a new scheme to secure utter dominance over the region, and of course it has you in its crosshairs. Now, I can't say that I found the first game's narrative to be much more than a reason to play the game, and I felt the same here in Retribution. Bouncing around New Orleans as everyone's errand boy remains the same here in the sequel, meeting a host of new key characters that will help you to flesh out the game's narrative.
Welcome to the revolution, tourist.
Now, while I don't feel that story or character development has ever been a strong point of the series, I will say that this time around, Skydance Interactive does a much better job of developing real antagonists to our character, instead of the way the first game kind of just put us in the way of ongoing events. The tourist actions from the first game have made him some enemies, so it's nice to see that play out here in the story. Moving on to gameplay, I'm going to assume that if you're watching this, you've played the first Saints and Sinners, and if you haven't, I strongly recommend that you go back and watch our complete review for the first game, play that, then come back. But for you Saints and Sinners veterans, gameplay-wise, you're going to feel right at home here, as jumping into Retribution and its 10 to 12 hour campaign just feels like the next day in Saints and Sinners. Now, I don't really mean that as a negative, as the first title was polished as hell, and to this day is still one of the gold standards for a full locomotion VR action title. But the developers definitely went with a if it ain't broke mentality here and played things a bit safe. Starting up a new game, you were given the option of either importing your save from the first game, giving you the benefit of starting with the gear and recipes you attained in the first game, or starting over here in Retribution. Though starting over in Retribution doesn't mean that you're starting over from scratch, as the streets of Orleans in Retribution are much more dangerous with increased zombie numbers and enemy NPC factions, not to mention the inclusion of night missions, but more on that in a bit. As such, players starting out fresh will see that the old crafting tables have been leveled up a bit already. In addition to your armory, the bus is stocked with some higher end toys, and your new base of operations down in the catacombs is filled with junk to recycle. Also that you can hit the first mission in fighting form and not swinging spoons and frying pans. Now I gotta say I was a little torn with starting off so well prepared, as the survival fan of me didn't really like this, as half the fun of the first game for me was that rag to riches progression. That being said, I also do like kicking ass. Anyways, regardless of what side of that you land on, the increased zombie count and faction NPC altercations early on does burn through some of that early buffer you start with. So for those not being super stealthy, you will quickly find yourself back to scavenging in order to survive. The addition of 2 crafting tables is where players will find all the new toys and perks here in Retribution, opening a whole new reason to scavenge. New weapons range from an Uzi and sawed-off shotgun to more heavy weapons like the chainsaw and grenade launcher. In addition, weapons can now be modified with such add-ons as silencers and laser sights. And while most of the toys are on the one crafting table, the second table is devoted more to the character buffs, such as the much appreciated increase in stamina, various combat gloves, as well as further buffs to combat resilience. So essentially, more of what we got in the first game, making you an even bigger badass this time. Along with this also comes a few new ingredients to keep an eye out for, most notably of which is what the game calls phosphorus, an ingredient found predominantly in items scrounged at night and highlighted by the flashlight's new ultraviolet mode. Phosphorus is the key ingredient for crafting at the 2 new tables, and as such, night missions become the predominant new feature here in the sequel, not just for crafting, but in the game's mission structures as well, not only making new missions playable only at night, but going as far as to include an entire side mission hustle to the game based around night raids. These set of side missions introduce a trading network led by a contact known as the Pawn King. Once introduced, a section in your notepad opens up listing each of the game's areas and 3 possible retrieval missions you can take on at night, providing you can find the contact in each map. And traveling at night, whether on a Pawn King side mission or one of the game's many story missions, is definitely where I found that Retribution was at its best, feeling a little more fresh and a little more dangerous than the first game. Higher zombie count and more aggressive zombies are par for the course at night, compounded by, of course, your reliance on staying in the shadows to remain undetected, while simultaneously relying heavily on your flashlight to navigate the dark streets. Night raids consequently also offer up the chance for better loot, coming often in the form of not only the aforementioned phosphorus ingredient, but also higher end weapons and other survivors' abandoned backpacks, which you can now pillage. Now, honestly, I would have liked to have seen the night mode ramp up the zombie count even a bit more, but even at this level, I got the sense the Quest 2 was barely keeping it together, so it's understandable. Back into the daylight, and Walking Dead Chapter 2 honestly feels more like Chapter 1.5. As of the 12 areas you visit, only 4 are new. Old areas like the Shallows, Rampart, Via Corolla, and the Ward all return, and while noticeably war-torn, are still very familiar. Feeling all the more familiar, scrounging for mostly the same items. And seriously, what is it with the barbecue lighters in New Orleans? The new areas are welcome though, and bring with them a bit more complexity and verticality, as most of them bring us into the more urban areas of New Orleans. Thankfully, while Retribution retreads many of the areas and ideas from the first game, like I had previously mentioned, it also ramps up the overall level of combat, making it more necessary than before to show up to areas ready to fight. This is where the new crafting tables and the toys that come with them again help Retribution feel like something new, the chainsaw being a real standout, and honestly, almost reason enough to play the sequel. Is all types of brutal fun and sees Saints and Sinners dip its toe into some of the deeper zombie carnage that I wanted from the sequel. Unfortunately, the old Saints and Sinners game engine once again being used here seems to only be able to do so much, so don't expect any leg amputations or entrails spilling out. A disappointment for me that I'm a little fucked up like that. Now, like I said, much of what is here is more of the same, and while maybe not exciting to hear, it also isn't a bad thing, as I personally love the game loop and the weighty methodical combat of the first game. Unfortunately, here in the Quest version, there is a surprising level of jank and lack of polish that simply wasn't there in the first game. From items floating in the air and zombies stuck on geometry to weapons that won't cut, I even found myself falling into areas of the game world where I couldn't get out of and had to restart. This, when taken with the visual issues of the Quest 2 version, Retribution feels a little rushed for holiday 2022, which is really sad considering the polish of the previous release. And yeah, those visual issues. Now, the first Saints and Sinners was honestly a visual marvel, running on both the Quest and Quest 2, and while not perfect, came off a perfectly playable port of the PC version. And while Chapter 2 is definitely playable, I would probably now use the word serviceable, as here it often comes off, to my eyes, worse than the first game. Levels are filled with very blurry and low resolution textures, made even worse at times by some pretty intense texture popping. And not just from objects off in the distance, but from things right in front of you, including ground textures at your feet, sometimes blinking in and out as you simply move your head around. Thankfully, the foveated rendering here isn't too aggressive, but the reliance on fog that the first game used to keep the draw distance at bay is outed here in the sequel, with some of the new areas sporting some fairly large-sized indoor areas, and without the fog, they often just visually white out when looking at them from a distance. My thinking here is that the drop in overall visual quality and polish throughout Retribution is due largely in part to the increased focus on zombie aggression and overall combat when combined with the visually more ambitious new stages. But I still can't shake the feeling that the Quest 2 version was also a little rushed here. Fortunately, Chapter 2 visually fares much better in the night missions, which is where a bunch of the game takes place. The ability to use the cover of night to hide draw distances is very obviously the Quest's best friend here, as a noticeable increase to texture detail can be instantly seen on vehicles and buildings, along with a drastic decrease of texture pop into boot. Making things even better here is the drastic increase in the brightness of the flashlight, a key complaint that I had in the first game and an improvement that is very, very welcomed here, especially considering the sequel's focus on night missions. Now, all this being said, Chapter 2 on the Quest 2 is still a marvel running on this hardware, but I really feel like we are seeing the hardware push to its limits here, and I will admit it definitely impacted my enjoyment level of playing the sequel, as it often felt simply unfinished. Fortunately, on the audio side of things, everything seems to be on point here in the sequel, retaining the first game's level of quality despite a few audio glitches here and there. Now, I was a big fan of the first game's audio design, enjoying the nuanced music and loving the weight of combat in both the melee and range. So more of the same here is good in my books, and really shouldn't be too much of a surprise, as most of the effects and music tracks are simply recycled here. But the new voice actors brought in for the new characters retain the same quality and tone from the first, and the chainsaw sounds about as gnarly as you would hope, so life is good. And that brings me to my final thoughts and review score. The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners Chapter 2 Retribution, well, a standalone title, is much less a sequel to the first game than it is a continuation. Jumping into Retribution is VR gaming comfort food to be sure, as it felt like just the next day in New Orleans, as I instantly fell right back into that familiar game loop, with enough new recipes, weapons, and areas to entice me to head back out into the zombie apocalypse. A new story keeps things fresh, and the option of night missions along with a stronger focus on combat is also a welcome change, as it increased the game difficulty without going too action heavy so as to change the tone of the gameplay. However, with the Quest 2 version being the only one releasing thus far, those with PCs or planning on getting a PSVR 2, you might want to wait until Chapter 2 gets released on those platforms next year, as the Quest 2 version visually suffers here. The VR Grid gives The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners Chapter 2 Retribution for the Quest 2 a 7.5. I had fun venturing back into one of my favorite VR franchises, and more of a good thing is still a good thing. Unfortunately, on the Quest 2, Retribution feels a bit like sloppy seconds. Anyways, guys, that's it for us. Let us know what you think of this review. Are you still super excited? Are you a little disappointed? Or are you just going to hold out for another version of this game? And if so, which one? And don't forget, guys, to tune in to the Virtual Boys podcast each and every Thursday evening here, live on YouTube at 6 p.m. Pacific time and 9 p.m. Eastern time. And if you can't catch it live, don't worry, because later that evening, it'll be live everywhere on all the major podcast providers. As always, guys, we will catch you on our next video.